It's that interesting time of year again. I've been hearing this a lot via media, via people on social media, like traditional and social. Could have worded that a little less awkwardly. It's fine. Go with it. Do it live. Um, if the NHL had a 1 versus 8 scenario for playoff teams, here's how it would go. Number 1 would be Tampa. They would play number 8 Columbus. Number 2 would be Washington as a division winner. They would play number 7 Carolina. Number 3 would be Boston. They would play Pittsburgh. Number 4 would be the Islanders. They'd play against Toronto. And they'd have home ice. One of the big arguments about a month ago was that it was unfair that Toronto would start the playoffs on the road. And if we went with a 1v8 system, that wouldn't happen. If we went with a 1v8 system right now, that absolutely would happen due to their struggles down the stretch. And, now I'm seeing Toronto fans go, well, you didn't struggle. They got 100 points. They still finished 5th in the East. West, we would have had Calgary at number 1 against number 8 Colorado. Number 2 would have been Nashville. They would have been against Vegas. That would have been an interesting first-round matchup. San Jose would have played Dallas, and Winnipeg, St. Louis. Really doesn't make a big difference. I think the big problem that people have at this time of year, and this is what I keep hearing, is some good teams are going to go home in the first round. Yeah, that's kind of the way that's supposed to work. Now, for people my age or around my age, we all remember when 16 teams out of 21 would make the playoffs, and you would have teams that were absolute crap qualifying for the playoffs. And there wasn't an occasion where a good team would go home in the first round, minus maybe one series a year. Other than that, the teams that got knocked out were either good teams that got upset by one of those crappy teams that squeaked their way into the playoffs, or, if it was a good team, they were that one team that was also against a good team. Other than that, it was usually just bad teams that got knocked out in the first round. As a Canuck fan, I remember. I don't have a problem with the system where a good team goes home in the first round. Like, you could argue that Toronto-Boston, well, we've seen this matchup a lot of times. Yeah, but if we went 1 versus 8, it's not going to get a whole lot better. I remember the 1 versus 8 system. There were some teams that kept meeting each other in the first round too, or second round. I think that it's important to establish yourself as a contender, so it doesn't matter who you're facing in the first round. This year's Pittsburgh is a good example of that. So Pittsburgh's in against an Islanders team that's overachieved all year, and they've been a fantastic team. They lack that big superstar player. Barzal could get there, but right now he's not there yet. And so we're in a situation where it's Crosby, Malkin, Matt Murray in the playoffs, first round playoffs, Letang, as long as he can stay healthy. You've got all these really big name players against kind of a no-name team from the Islanders. And while people are trying to give flack, there's people who believe in the Islanders that are trying to give flack to media types and me. I don't consider myself media type about picking the Penguins. It's easy to pick the Penguins. The New York Islanders haven't had playoff success since 1984. It has been a lot of stops and starts since then, more stops than starts. They've been into, I want to say, one conference final. I know 93, every third place team came out of the division and they played against Montreal. And that is, I believe, as close as they've been to getting back into a Stanley Cup final since 1984. The Penguins, on the other hand, have won 5 Stanley Cups in the last 28 years, 27, 28 years, 28 years. And so it's very easy to project that the Pittsburgh Penguins, who've won 3 Stanley Cups in the last decade, 2 in the last 3 years, to project that they would win in the first round. And yes, good teams are going to go home. Because here's the other thing. With 31 teams now in the league and 16 making the playoffs, they're all good teams. We can look at Colorado and say, well, Montreal would have knocked down Colorado. They actually would have knocked down Dallas as well, and Vegas. So, they're the better team. I can't argue that Montreal, against a Western Conference foe, would have probably done pretty well in the playoffs, but it's the system we've got, and when you look at it, there's almost always a team that gets hosed out of a playoff spot. Which, harkening back to the 80s, that happened too when you had divisions that were weaker than others. And the NHL's keeping this format for next year. I think they'll probably revisit it the year after. I think they may do some kind of a tweak on it. But you're always going to have good teams against each other in the first round as long as we have 16 teams in the playoffs. Now, if Tom Dundon, who was very outspoken about wanting to see more teams in the playoffs if he got his way, then you would start seeing some kind of mediocre teams make the playoffs. For instance, in the West, if you'd expanded it to, say, 20 teams, so you had a play-in situation, Arizona and Chicago would have still been eligible in the West, and in the East it would have been Montreal and Florida. So if you expand it by 2 teams, just 2, you end up with Montreal in there, which Montreal fans would say, yep, we belong in there. But then you end up with Florida as well. So if you had 7 versus 10, 8 versus 9, best of 3 series, whatever you had to play your way into the playoffs, to me that dilutes it. And it makes the regular season less important. And people always argue, well, it makes it so there's more games that mean something down the stretch. Yeah, Arizona games meant something right until the last week. Same for Chicago. That would have left Minnesota 1 point out. That would have left Vancouver 3 points out. But when you look at the seasons that Minnesota and Vancouver had, should they really have been 1 or 3 points out? And then again, now the disparity between the East and the West would have been even worse. Because now you would have had Philadelphia being out, and Chicago being in, Philadelphia being 2 points behind Chicago, 1 point behind Minnesota. But under this scenario, I'm telling you, it would create more trouble than it would help. And you look at teams that were resting guys the last couple of games. Does that get worse if you have more teams in the playoffs? Probably. So yeah, the setup isn't going to change, and the fact that good teams go home in the first round, it sucks. It does. But that's sort of the way that the system was set up, and it's the way it's going to go. And the other thing that struck me when I was looking at this, because I've started to see a lot of comments about how the NHL set this up so Vegas is going to win, and Vegas is this and Vegas is that. Vegas currently sits, or finished the season, I should say, 16th overall in the NHL out of 31 teams. So that's not a very good job if the results were skewed in favor of Vegas. They did a terrible job this year. Last year, Vegas was top 5 in the league. This year, they're 16th. And while I do see them as being the better team between themselves and San Jose, due to the acquisition of Stone and what that did for the whole team, would I be surprised if San Jose knocked them out? No. And that's the other thing that's changed from the 80s until now, is because we've got so many good teams in the playoffs, upsets aren't as surprising as they used to be. So as like an example, Washington and Carolina. So you've got the Capitals, defending Stanley Cup champions. You got Carolina, young upstarts. Well, Carolina had a pretty good season, and if they could win one in Washington, win both of their games at home, go up 3-1, that wouldn't be entirely surprising. Surprising, yes, but not in the lines of miracle on Manchester, LA Kings knocking out the Gretzky-led Oilers back in the mid-'80s. Those were truly shocking moments that there will be videos about as the summer rolls along, maybe even as the spring rolls along. But yeah, we're going to see some good teams go home in the first round, and it's going to be a shame. But I think that really illustrates just how strong this league is, just how much parity there is. Because the NBA playoffs are going to start pretty quick too. And there's some mediocrity there because basketball, it's easier to load up your team. And there are some truly super teams there that we don't see in the NHL due to a combination of the salary cap and just the talent level being very evenly spaced. The funny thing is, when the NHL started expanding beyond 21 teams, and there was talk about them, spreading the talent out, the word that got used the most was diluting the talent. And that super teams should still, like the Penguins of the early 90s, the Oilers of the 80s, these should still be able to exist because, you shouldn't be punishing teams for drafting well and trading well. And, that was the argument against the cap as well. Here we are over 10 years into the cap era, and yeah, teams having to sell the guys off because they can't afford to keep them, and the talent level being nicely distributed around the NHL is the thing. And it's worked so far. It does mean that creating a dynasty, an official dynasty, 3 cups in 4 years. Pittsburgh has a shot at that this year. It's a lot harder to get a dynasty than it used to be, and that is another reason why I'm taking Pittsburgh to knock out the Islanders in the first round, because they are going for 3 and 4 years, and I think there is a certain amount of inspiration to be drawn from that. Hey, the funny part is I don't cheer for Pittsburgh, and anybody who's been a subscriber to this channel for more than 2 weeks knows, Shannon's not a big Pittsburgh fan. I'm just realistic. I know that taking Pittsburgh out in the first round is a lot easier said than done, and they have a ton of weapons, and I do wish the Islanders the best. And for Toronto, who ended up finishing, I believe, 7th overall in the NHL, it may seem unfair to go on the road and play Boston. But if they were against the Islanders in the first round, I would be leaning a little bit towards the Islanders. And that would be a very tough series to call. But I think I would be leaning slightly towards the Islanders, between the Islanders and Toronto. That Tavares effect on that team, if they were against him in the playoffs, I really think that would fire them up. So anyways, the playoffs start tomorrow, and for people who are subscribers to this channel and wondering about the draft lottery is, of course, today, and there will be a live stream on this channel of the draft lottery when it takes place. And I'll be surrounded by jerseys when it takes place, is my guess. No, I'll figure out a way to set this up so that I can be watching TV, but I will not be broadcasting the television screen to you fine people, because that's a copyright issue. So I'll have a board up, and we'll put the logos on the board as it goes along. And after the draft lottery tomorrow, we start the playoffs. I hope everybody has fun with the playoffs, because it is truly the best hockey that we see all year, and it is amazing. So there you guys go. And also, for people who are wondering, Yvonne and I are going to do our playoff picks either later today or tomorrow, where I put up who I think is going to win in each round, and she puts up who she thinks is going to win in each round, and it's kind of a fun thing. We did that yesterday, and we're close. We're very close on who we think is going to win. There are some differences, but we'll see how that turns out. So there you go. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for all your support. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video, and hey, good teams are going to go home in the first round, because the league has a lot of good teams. Thank you guys so much. I'll talk to you again soon.